Hey Tim, how you doing? Thanks for doing
Good,
this.
thanks. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, when I came across your profile, I was like, this is too good to be true. It's like someone who actually knows his stuff, who's deeply embedded in the topic, who clearly likes to communicate about it and is very good at it. And so, yeah, I'm very excited to spend, I don't know, 45 minutes asking you some questions. And the context for this
Cool.
is, I'd love to. I've described this in the post, but that announcing this, but I've come. I'm gone on my own journey when it comes to nuclear. I kind of come from a very anti-nuclear German household, and growing up in Germany, it's yeah, it's very easy to be anti-nuclear. And nowadays that's the mainstream opinion, right? But I really grew up with a Greenpeace magazine just being instilled with this is dangerous, we shouldn't be doing this. And when Fukushima happened and Merkel said no more nuclear in Germany, everyone was on the street celebrating. But I've come a long way since then. But I still have that side in me, and I'd like to ask you all the hard questions that I know the community that I come from have. So yeah, that's kind of the context for today.
Sounds
Um, and
great.
I, and I'm sure you're ready for it. But I actually wanted to start somewhere else. How did you get to do what you do?
That's a good question. I actually fell into nuclear by accident. I was a research scientist in cosmochemistry, of all things, before I joined the nuclear industry. I learned my trade as an analyst during my PhD, where I measured the age of the solar system using meteorites and measuring the amount of radioactive decay that had happened in these rocks that had fallen from outer space. And that's really where
Wow.
I learned, yeah, it was amazing. And that's where I learned how to run these analytical instruments, scanning electron microscopes, mass spectrometers, all of these different techniques that we can use to measure the chemistry of things, whether they be foodstuffs or environmental samples, or in my case, meteorites, or in my current job, nuclear materials. And so that's how I ended up in the nuclear industry. And as for kind of all the public facing stuff, like publishing a book on the subject, doing lots of talks on the subject, when I joined the nuclear industry, I had a lot of kind of like prior knowledge of, well, I knew my stuff about chemistry and radioactivity. I kind of knew about nuclear power and kind of where it fit in politically and environmentally. And as I learned more and read more and asked people things, because I'm really good at asking questions. I love asking people questions. As I was learning all of this stuff about nuclear power, while simultaneously reading the news and following the conversation about net zero and energy security and energy affordability and energy abundance, I was kind of seeing these two things and thinking, I know that there are people putting these things together, but it's not a kind of a mainstream part of the conversation about how we decarbonize and how we provide energy security in Europe. And I just kept finding myself asking, why didn't anybody tell me all this stuff before about the land footprint of nuclear, about the mining requirements of nuclear, about nuclear waste, about how much energy you get from a really small amount of uranium? And it just seemed so obvious to me that nuclear, rather than kind of being an afterthought and well, if we must, it's got to be absolutely central to a sensible energy policy, which is what motivated me to write Going Nuclear, which is, I guess, how I ended up on this live stream with you today.
You did, and I actually wanted you kind of to explain your core thesis, but you kind of just did that. I think we can take that. Why did you write a book? That's an interesting kind of channel to pick. So yeah, how did
Yeah,
you end up writing your
I
book?
love reading. I love reading. I like creating things in the mediums that I like, kind of absorbing things, and I read a lot. And I'd go into Waterstones, which is the big book chain that we've. I don't know if they have Waterstones in the rest of Europe, but we've.
No, but I
It's a
lived in the
few.
UK for 11 years, so I
Oh,
know it
you
well.
know it well then. So I was going into my local bookshop, and there would be lots and lots of books about environmentalism, climate change, net zero, fossil fuels, decarbonisation, and it kind of struck me that there isn't really one about nuclear power. And this was kind of around the time that it was really crystallizing in my mind that a
Yeah.
really sensible nuclear policy has got to be central to a sensible energy policy, whether you're interested in environmentalism or energy security or economic growth, or all three, as most people are, in my experience. And it just kind of seemed like there was a space missing on the bookshelf. And so I thought, well, maybe they're in these books anyway. And so, like you do on a Saturday when you're in the city, you leaf through the books and you flick to the index and you go to nuclear. And if it was mentioned at all in lots of these environmental books, it was just kind of hand waved off as, well, it's too expensive and it takes too long and we're in a climate crisis and it's really urgent. And so we don't even, case closed, we don't need to kind of engage with this critically. I thought this is such a missed opportunity to kind of make this argument and clarify my own views on these things as well. And so that's why I chose to write a book about it, because, you know, although we live in the kind of the age of short form social media content where everyone is watching shorts and reading really pithy posts on Twitter and LinkedIn, I still think, thankfully, there is a large audience out there for long form texts, including popular science books. So
must have been very cool when you made the cut of one of the top popular science books at
it was amazing,
as far as I know.
Yeah,
so well done.
I couldn't believe it when I got when I got the book deal. Actually, yeah, I couldn't believe it. I nearly did cartwheels through central London. I was so excited.
There's a bunch of kind of themes that I want to unpack with you. Let's start with the one that you've also probably have maybe most experience in and you've been most vocal about, which is safety. And this is obviously a big one because as far as I understand, there have been 3 major accidents, 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, right? They were all very different impacts as well. But I guess that's what most people think about when that kind of primal fear comes up, when you see the images, you remember the stories. We all have some sort of connection to those events. So let's start there. What would you say how would you address that fear that all of us somewhere have?
For sure. So I still remember exactly where I was when I learned about Fukushima. I was actually on a boat at the time watching the footage of the tsunami crashing against the coast of Japan. Yeah, I was actually on a ferry up in Scotland. I was an A-level student and kind of following the news, because I was an A-level student in physics and geology, actually. And so like a nuclear meltdown caused by a tsunami was kind of like it was very, very interesting for me as a 17-year-old watching that unfold. And I remember watching it kind of playing out in the news and being just as kind of concerned and frightened as everybody else. As, you know, kind of looking at this on the big picture, nothing is perfectly safe, okay? And so if we're looking for a perfect solution, if we're looking for a source of energy that is perfectly safe with no risk of harm to anybody, then we might as well give up, because nothing is perfectly safe, right? And I think this is a theme actually that kind of I try and use generally in life, but definitely when it comes to environmentalism, there are no perfect solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the game that we should be playing is, how do we maximize the benefit to society and the environment with minimizing the bad things, but being honest and pragmatic enough to realize that we cannot completely eliminate the downsides of any technology that we use. And when we look at the history of nuclear power, which, by the way, is in its 70th year this year. Yeah. It's been 70 years in October since commercial nuclear power began. And that was actually in this country, in Britain, with Calder Hall, when Queen Elizabeth II switched on Calder Hall nuclear power station. So we've been doing this experiment for a long time now. It's 70 years. It's basically a human lifetime. It's got an absolutely impeccable safety record that's punctuated by a very small number of very high visibility events, namely the ones that you mentioned, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. I didn't dedicate that much time to 3 Mile Island in going nuclear, actually, because nobody died and nobody was exposed to anything above background radiation. And so there's not really much to say there. Chernobyl is the really consequential one, because it's very interesting if you look at the data and you look at how many reactors were built in the couple of years preceding Chernobyl. The world built more nuclear reactors in the 10 years leading up to Chernobyl than it has built since. And on a European scale, Europe built more reactors in the 5 years leading up to Chernobyl than it has built since. And so it really is no stretch to say that Chernobyl, you can see it in the data, you can see 1986 and nuclear new build just drops off and it never really recovered after that.
Yeah.
Chernobyl was the really consequential one. And you've got to remember the context of Chernobyl. It happened during the time right in the midst of the Cold War in the 1980s. Geopolitical tensions were running high, to put it mildly. And then Chernobyl happened. And it's kind of in the decades since, it's gained this mythic reputation and this mythic kind of place in the public consciousness of being this uniquely intolerable event that's kind of consigned nuclear to the mustn't touch pile kind of forever. But actually, when you step back and look at the data, it wasn't as bad as almost everybody thinks. And I just want to kind of emphasize that I'm not trying to diminish what happened at Chernobyl, and I'm not trying to trivialize it, because it was avoidable. It was totally avoidable. And every death from Chernobyl was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened. However, when we look at the wider context, for example, air pollution, and I'm not kind of, what's the word? I'm not kind of trying to play smoke and mirrors here. I choose air pollution because most of the air pollution in the world comes from burning fossil fuels for energy. And so the fossil fuels that we burn instead of splitting atoms of uranium, they kill the same number of people every 30 minutes as Chernobyl killed ever. And so by the time this webcast is over, more people will have died from air pollution than died in Chernobyl. And so to kind of place Chernobyl as this uniquely intolerable event that means that we should just kind of dispense with nuclear power, it just doesn't make sense at all, because in the meantime we're burning fossil fuels that are not just a little bit more deadly, but orders of magnitude more deadly than fissioning uranium. And so it goes with Fukushima as well. You've got to remember that Japan was dealing with the aftermath of a tsunami, and one of the biggest earthquakes ever recorded, as it dealt with the fallout from Fukushima. But again, there was one death from Fukushima. Even that one is contested.
But hundreds of thousands of people displaced in both cases.
They were.
In all three cases, right? So I think
yes,
this is
so
another
more
element.
than 100,000 people were displaced from Fukushima. And most of the... Well, in fact, there were almost 25,000 deaths indirectly related to Fukushima from the stress and the turmoil of being displaced. And most of those deaths were elderly people who were removed from care home settings and hospitals and things like that. However, in retrospect, it was probably a huge overreaction, because the amounts of radiation that almost everybody who was evacuated would have been exposed to were no more than the background radiation that you get naturally just by being alive on planet Earth. And
why are we so terrified of radiation? Like, why do we overreact? Because I think that's a consistent theme, right? Why do we overreact to radiation?
I think part of it's popular culture. I mean, radiation is such a great tool that we use in films, in video
Medicine,
games.
everything, yeah.
And it's this kind of invisible, mysterious thing. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, unless you make it audible with the Geiger counter. But even the click, click, click of the Geiger counter, you know, the sound, that's kind of used as this device to indicate a spectre, kind of an unseen danger and peril. And so I think we just live in a popular culture that says radiation is bad. And we kind of, that kind of translates through to the nuclear question as well. And it's also politically as well. The policies surrounding radiation are disproportionate when it comes to radiation protection. So the International Atomic Energy Agency has a guideline that from nuclear power, nobody in the general public should be exposed to more than 1 millisievert per year. Just for context, background radiation in most European countries is a couple of millisieverts, somewhere between 2 and 5 millisieverts per year naturally. So where I live in the UK, it's 2.5 millisieverts, something like that. In Finland, it's 3 times higher. There is
Why
never
do we have that
ever
policy. Like, how does that make sense?
So it's a guideline. Okay, so it's an International Atomic Energy Agency guideline, but lots of governments kind of adopt it and implement it and work to that. And that was what motivated the mass evacuations in the areas surrounding Fukushima. And I'm not trying to beat down too hard on Japan here. Almost any other country in the world would have reacted in the same way. It just happened to be in Japan, and so we've got this real misunderstanding of radiation and this irrational fear of radiation. And there's a whole chapter in my book about it, radiophobia, which is not a term that I coined, but I do hope to popularize it and kind of make people think about these things a little more rationally. Radiation is nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, and I think when I think about, for example, I have a colleague who actually used to work on a nuclear submarine in the US for many years. And
Wow.
And those things are just mind blowing. Like the idea that one of those submarines can just be powered for years on end, kind of autonomously, by these little pieces that it carries. It's just mind blowing. So
It's
I'm
unbelievable,
definitely
isn't
with
it?
you
Yeah,
there.
I agree.
But okay, you already went into kind of the counterfactual with fossils, which is obviously like I'm fully with you, but I actually think it's the wrong counterfactual. So
Okay.
if I use a counterfactual for me, it's renewables, right? Because obviously today, you're perfectly right. What happened when we turned off all the nuclear facilities in Japan or in Germany? We ramped up fossils. So looking back, I'm with you. But looking forward, we live in an age where adding a kilowatt of solar is in many cases the cheapest thing we can do, right? And I don't like, yeah. So I'm trying to think when you do that counterfactual, can you make the argument with renewables?
I would challenge the claim that adding a kilowatt of solar is cheap. So that's probably based on the levelized cost of electricity, as a lot of these arguments are. And the levelized cost of electricity is a real convenient and conceptually simple thing to talk about. It's the kind of thing that sells politically, because politicians can A, understand it, and B, sell it. It's the total cost of, say, a solar panel or a wind turbine and the amount of electricity that it will produce over its lifetime, divided by how much it costs, okay? But the levelized cost of electricity does not take into account the wider system costs,
Yeah.
the enormous amount of transmission infrastructure that you need to build for these very dilute and dispersed renewables, the balancing that you have to do with the grid, because these renewables are, well, in the case of wind and solar, are intermittent, which, if you ask me, is just energy industry propaganda for unreliable. There are all these system costs that you have to factor in. And when you do that, the case isn't clear cut at all. In fact, the levelized cost of electricity vastly underestimates the cost of wind and solar and vastly overestimates the cost of nuclear power. And I'm not anti-wind and solar. I'm not even really pro-nuclear. Fundamentally, I'm pro-energy abundance, because we need abundant energy for our
100%.
societies to flourish, and not just the total amount. I mean, you see it every January, don't you? You see all the think tanks and the kind of the media publishing, oh, it's a record-breaking year for wind and solar, but it ignores those still cold evenings in November when renewable generation is kind of sub 1 gigawatt. You can't just wave that away. And so I'm not pro-nuclear. I'm not anti-renewable. I'm pro-energy abundance. I'm pro-clean energy, and I'm pro the energy that we need in reliable form that our society needs as well. And so, kind of that renewables are good at getting us started, and they have undoubtedly got us started with gaining a little bit of energy independence and cleaning up our grids as well, but they're not enough on their own. You need that nuclear there to provide that reliable energy for when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And my worry is that if we rely too much on wind and solar, we will just end up with energy rationing and energy scarcity in Europe. And Europe being kind of like real high developed economies with very high living standards, fundamentally reliant on technology that you need energy to power. With that energy rationing and that energy scarcity, that will end up killing people. I mean, far more people die every year from the cold than they do from the heat. We hear a lot about people dying from heat globally, but cold is way worse. And more people will die from the cold if we have energy scarcity, which is exactly what happened in Japan, actually, after Fukushima. It wasn't just the increase in air pollution because of the excess coal that they burned, because they shut down all their power stations. Energy also became more expensive, and thousands of old people died of cold because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. I fear that will become more common in Europe as well, if we rely too heavily on renewables without building out the nuclear baseload simultaneously.
And I think that's fair. When I think about baseload, the comparison is probably gas, right? Like if I think about how in Europe we're trying to create that baseload. And for me, fascinating is also if we look at China, right? Like they still have coal, but they're trying to use, I guess, less and less. They're planning to build 110 gigawatts, something crazy of nuclear. And they're building out renewables like no one else, right? So clearly it's not an either or, but it's a mix of those.
Definitely, yeah. And for me, exactly right. It's not an either or, it's a both. I really do think like net zero is possible by 2050. Totally possible, but we have to start now And we have to simultaneously build out that nuclear base load whilst expanding wind and solar.
Okay, but then like you're in the UK, I'm in Italy. We're not in China. And the two last examples that I've seen of kind of nuclear facilities that went online, one in the US, one in France, took 17 years.
Yeah, it's terrible.
We're billions more expensive than we expected. We're not building like China. We're not permitting like China. So let's make the case specific to Europe, not to somewhere abstract. Do you think we can actually build nuclear reactors on time to make a difference for net zero in 2050 here?
Okay, so I'm in the UK, and I don't know if this is something to be proud of, but it's hilarious or depressing depending on which side of the bed I wake up on. But when Hinkley Point C is finished, it will be the most expensive nuclear power station ever built. It was supposed to come on £50 billion was the last estimate that I read, but it will probably be even more than that. And it was supposed to come online last year after, I think it was 7 or 8 years of build time. It probably won't come online for another 6 or 7 years. And so it's double the time, and it's the most expensive reactor in the world. And so this is something that's, well, it's not just close to my heart and something that I think about, but I'm also paying for it through my taxes as well. So to your point, the way that we currently do nuclear in Europe, what I want to happen isn't possible. So I would like to see a French-style nuclear rollout from the 70s through the 90s, where France built 56 reactors in 25 years. I would like to see something like that in every European country. It's not possible with the way that we do it at the moment because it takes too long and it's too expensive. However, it wasn't always this way, and it's not a problem with nuclear per se. This is a much wider problem of how we're terrible at building infrastructure. And I'll give you an example of one of the reasons why Hinkley Point C has ballooned in cost and has been delayed. Have you heard of the fish disco? Have you come across this? Okay, so Hinkley Point C is on the Severn estuary, and it has intake pumps to pull river water into the power station that it will use to cool the reactor, and then it will pump it back out. That will inevitably suck in some wildlife, namely fish, from the river. There are certain species of fish in the UK that are protected by law, and to mitigate these fish from being sucked into the intake pumps, we've had to spend £700 million on fish protection measures for Hinkley Point C. One of them is an underwater series of loudspeakers that will blast sound to scare the fish away, hence fish disco, which is kind of funny, but it's also not funny given that it's cost £700 million. Now, how many fish are we talking about? Well, when we look at the total number of fish, it's about the equivalent of a small fishing trawler per year. However, the reason that the system was put in place was for the protected fish, such as salmon and sea trouts. And when you look at the environmental assessment of how many fish that system will save per year, it's something like 125 fish per year. It's like a fish every couple of days. And you can do the back of the envelope calculation of, okay, we've spent £700 million on this power station.
That's some expensive salmon, huh?
That's some expensive salmon. It's like £30,000 per fish.
Yeah, but that's the reality in Europe, right?
Which is like, it's completely disproportionate. And that money, if it was going to be spent on environmental protection, I mean, just parking to one side the fact that we're talking about a nuclear power station which will supply electricity for more than 1 million people for more than 60 years without emitting any carbon dioxide on an area of land smaller than the town that I live in. It's a quarter of a square mile of land. Parking that to one side, if we were going to spend £700 million protecting nature, we could have probably spent it far better than protecting 125 fish per year.
But this is a case in point, right? Like, this is preventing us, even if we wanted, from a build out like in France, I imagine, right? So is it even possible in Europe today?
It is possible. These are not laws of physics and they're not laws of nature. It's not like we have to invent a fusion reactor or invent a graphene super material to make this happen. The technology is there, but the regulation is completely broken. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying 5-10 minutes ago. We want these perfect solutions. We want our nuclear power stations to kill 0 fish, to kill 0 birds, to take up 0 amount of land. That is just not possible. Okay, there will be some collateral damage to the environment and to wildlife when we build nuclear power stations. But that's true for anything that we build. We might as well just pack up shop and go back to the Stone Age if that's the logical conclusion of that line of reasoning. And so it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. We can wind this back. And France is a case in point that you can do it. And it's interesting to note as well that France has built one reactor this side of the year 2000. So the last reactor in its rollout went online in 1999. Since then, it's built one reactor. But of those original reactors that were built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all of them are still working. Okay, and France today has got the second least carbon-intensive electricity in Europe, and it's Europe's biggest electricity exporter by a long way, not just a little bit, a really, really long way. Which, you know, we're still reaping those environmental benefits of France's nuclear program 40 years on. And that's before we even start talking about the energy security as well.
So basically, to sum up the cost argument, you would argue, because when you look up, you know, the cost per kilowatt installed or something of a nuclear facility, especially in Europe, it's mind-blowing. It's very high. In China, it's a bit different, but it doesn't look good. Let's put it this way. So you would say that basically, if you would take the full cost of electricity from other sources, they're comparable, or how would you assess that?
So when you look at the system costs, there are many different ways you can calculate system costs. There's a whole literature dedicated to this, and people argue about it ferociously in the published literature. But oftentimes, when you take into account system costs, renewables become more expensive than nuclear power, especially as you increase the share of renewables in the grid. Those system costs increase exponentially. When we look at the cost kind of on a capacity basis, you would expect it to be slightly more expensive in Europe than, say, in China, for example, because thankfully we don't have Chinese employment rights. And so you would expect it to be a little bit more expensive. But it's far too expensive, and it's unacceptably expensive at the moment. But again, I just want to kind of zoom out and say that this isn't a nuclear-specific problem. We have these problems with all sorts of infrastructure projects. High-speed rail is a very hot topic at the moment in this country. We can't seem to build rail networks anymore. We can't build houses anymore. We can't build hospitals.
But any big infrastructure project is prone to these big problems, right? So I'm wondering, doesn't that push us towards smaller modular solutions?
You mean like small modular reactors?
I was going to go there next. I was thinking more kind of, a wind or solar facility. They're very small compared to nuclear. So there's less that can go wrong on that front.
Again, the problem with wind and solar, and that's kind of not true also, by the way, because we have a problem in this, again, we have a problem in this country with renewables in that we build these big fleets of wind turbines and solar panels, but then it's many, many years often before we actually build the infrastructure to wire them into the grid. And so it's not obvious that it's very fast to build wind and solar infrastructure, because it's not, because we've got all of that transmission infrastructure as well. But the kind of, again, the question isn't, do we do nuclear or wind and solar? They are fundamentally different technologies in that wind and solar are intermittent. They're just not going to be able to do it on their own. And I don't buy this idea of backup either. If you look at the grid storage that we've got in Europe at the moment, almost all of it, like 99% of it, is hydroelectric, is pumped hydro. And when you look at the capacity that most European countries have for pumped hydro storage, we're talking about enough backup for a couple of hours at most for most European countries. Norway is different and Sweden are different because of their topography. But major European countries, Germany, France, the UK, we're talking about minutes or hours worth of backup. And to think that we can compensate for wind and solar that can die down for days and weeks at a time using artificial batteries, I think is just ludicrous. Not only is it just crazy, crazy expensive, it's also pretty bad for the environment when you look at how much land you need for these battery farms, how much lithium you need, how much cobalt you need, how much copper you need. They start to look worse than burning fossil fuels in some ways. And so I just don't think that's a good idea either. And so it's not a question of should we kind of park nuclear and go all in on wind and solar. We can't do that, because what do they do when they're not working? And that is a question I don't think the kind of real passionate pro-renewable lobby has addressed in a satisfying and convincing way.
Okay, fair. Um, Next topic, also obviously very close to my heart, the way that I grew up, is the waste issue, right? And on the one hand, I think the things that we have going for it is obviously it's very little waste. There's actually so incredibly little material,
It is,
just in
yeah,
terms of the
surprising.
amount of it. On the other hand, it is material that sticks around for a long, long time. And as far as I know, only Finland has actually found a permanent solution. So, like, can you talk
That's
me
right,
through
yeah.
where do we stand on the waste disposal
Okay,
today?
you've probably heard the statistic, but for the benefit of those who haven't, if a typical European got all of their electricity over their entire lifetime from nuclear power alone, so zero fossil fuels, zero renewables, 100% nuclear powered life, their nuclear waste would fit in a coffee cup, something like that.
I hadn't heard that one, and that is mind blowing.
It is totally mind-blowing, and it goes back to the physics of uranium. You get a huge amount of energy from a very small amount of uranium, and the natural consequence of that is that you get a very small amount of waste for a huge amount of energy. And when you look at the world as a whole over the last 70 years, all of the high-level nuclear waste, which is really the stuff that people mean when they say nuclear waste, all of the high-level nuclear waste ever produced on the planet would fit into a cube about 33 meters across, which is not that big. It would fit inside a modest-sized concert hall. It's about 3 buses parked end to end. It's a cube that big. And so it's not that much. However, as you rightly pointed out, it sticks around for a long time, right? How long? Something like a couple of 100,000 years. Call it 1,000,000 years, something like that. What do we do with it? In the meantime, we can't just trivialize it away. We have to do something with it. And you rightly pointed out, Finland is the only country in the world at the moment with a working solution to this, and that is geological disposal. And they haven't actually started putting waste underground yet. It's still going through trial runs, but it will probably be this year when they really do it for real. And the
Is it
idea
only for
is
their
simple.
own waste, or will they like take
It
the
is.
waste from other countries?
It is. It's only for their own waste. However, they're the first country to do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if within our lifetimes we see some sort of European consortium, some sort of European collaboration where European countries with the right type of geology and the right, the right type of geological setting accept the waste from other countries as kind of we're all working together on this kind of stuff. However, the logic is really simple. It's if you put it underground and you leave it for long enough, because it's radioactive, it loses radioactivity over time. All radioactive substances become less radioactive over time. And so the idea is that nuclear waste on its own, it spontaneously transforms into just waste. It won't be radioactive in 1,000,000 years. And 1,000,000 years sounds like a really long time, right? It's kind of one of those jaw-dropping, eye-opening numbers. But it's not a long time geologically. Many rocks on the planet are hundreds of millions of years, if not billions of years old. That's thousands of millions. And so 1,000,000 years
It's pretty long for a human, right?
It's a long time for humanity.
How's Finland? How do they get it done? What are they doing?
So they amended their Nuclear Power Act decades ago. It was in the mid-'80s, saying that any of the nuclear waste that they produce in Finland has to be disposed of and dealt with in Finland. And it took them 40 years from deciding to dispose of it geologically to now, to having this working repository. And it's a combination of things. They had the right geology, although there are several geological settings where you can do this kind of thing. But, Finland, with its hard, impermeable, crystalline bedrock, it's a very long way from tectonic plate boundaries. It's got the geology, and crucially, it's got the political climate as well. It's got the continuity. There's a high level of public trust in institutions in Finland. Based on what I've read, anyway, that was one of the factors. And this kind of trust in public institutions and the continuity across successive governments for this policy meant that it's been successful because they're about to do it. They're the only country in the world that's done it. Although there are about a dozen others also pursuing geological disposal, including the UK and France and Sweden.
Why is it so expensive? Like, I saw some numbers about potentially the cost for disposal in the UK, for example, and it's like, I don't know, 60 billion pounds. I forgot the exact number, but it's so expensive. Why is that?
Everything's expensive in the UK.
I know, but
problem
that is particularly expensive.
Absolutely, it shouldn't be that expensive. From memory, Finland's repository cost a couple of billion euros. which sounds like a lot, but they do what most countries do, and they add a very small surcharge to the kilowatt hour of nuclear electricity and put it in a nuclear waste fund, kind of like a sovereign wealth fund for nuclear waste. Most countries that have nuclear reactors do that, and that's how Finland paid for it, and it will pay for all of the nuclear waste that Finland currently has and all of the nuclear waste until the end of this century, so it's not that bad. But again, everything's expensive in the UK. It's absolutely terrible, and so it's no surprise to me that, I mean, I hadn't heard that number, but I can full well believe it. It shouldn't be that expensive. We're terrible at building big pieces of infrastructure.
But so they put it underground in this bedrock, and then the idea is that the radioactivity wouldn't radiate beyond the immediate bedrock? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's right. So you don't need that much rock to block the radioactivity entirely, and this repository is hundreds of meters underground, so even just a couple of meters of rock would block it entirely. One of the things that you don't want to happen is water getting into the repository and flushing the radioactivity out. So they have many, many layers of containment in this repository. The fuel itself is actually one of the layers of containment. It's not like most people imagine, where it's green sludge that you could just wash away with your tap in your kitchen. It's uranium oxide. Right, they're fuel elements. They've been in reactors.
It's like a rock.
Yeah, it's solid. Yeah, they're like metal. They're like metal tubes, and you've got to remember these things have already been inside a nuclear reactor for 4 or 5 years at a couple of 100 degrees Celsius under crushing pressure, and survived that. And so they're pretty tough. And they designed these cylinders to put them in as well. These highly engineered cylinders, which are huge. Actually, I'm going like that, but they're actually like almost as tall as a house. These things, they're massive. And then the tunnels themselves underground are backfilled with clay. It's a type of clay called bentonite that swells when it gets wet, and so it self-seals should it get wet. And then it's hundreds of meters underground. And, you know, they've done the modeling of this kind of thing. Like, if it's worst case scenario and some of the radioactivity gets out and makes it to the surface, it will barely be detectable. And one of the nice things about radioactive waste is that although it's radioactive for a long time, most of that radioactivity diminishes very, very, very quickly.
Yeah,
most of the radioactivity, it's a very small number of radioactive isotopes in there that are responsible for most of the radiation, and they decay very, very quickly in just a few centuries. So that's the disposal method, but it's not my favorite method, actually, because there is another way, and that's recycling nuclear waste, because most of the atoms in nuclear waste, you can actually use it to produce nuclear power. We just don't do that at the moment. We have what's called a linear fuel cycle, which is a bit of an oxymoron, because I don't understand how something can be linear and a cycle at the same time. But whatever, that's the nuclear industry jargon. But it's basically like a once-through system for nuclear fuel. So we dig the uranium from the ground, we put it in a reactor, and then we get rid of it. But 95% of the atoms in the stuff that we're throwing away can actually be used to generate nuclear power. If we did that, there are two main advantages. First of all, obviously, we get more energy from the uranium that we dig from the ground. It's more than 100 times more energy for the uranium that we dig from the ground, which further reduces nuclear's already very small mining footprint. But secondly, and crucially to your question about the nuclear waste problem, when you recycle nuclear waste in this way, you get rid of the really long-lived radioisotopes. You're only left with the really short-lived ones. And so that million-year timescale that you have to store nuclear waste for before it becomes non-radioactive shrinks to just a couple of centuries, which isn't that long at all. I was in a pub.
What's the use case?
I was in a pub a couple of days ago that's a few centuries old. I mean, we build that kind of infrastructure all the time and have done for ages. So
why are we not doing this? Like, what would we use these used materials for?
So the type of reactor that you can recycle nuclear waste in are called fast reactors. And they were actually seen as the big thing back in the 60s and the 70s when they were first developed, because the world's nuclear power capacity was increasing. I mean, it's very interesting reading the kind of the interviews and the articles from the scientists and engineers at the time. They were having very similar conversations to what we're having about the environmental and human effects of fossil fuels, energy security, energy independence. And these fast reactors where they recycle the nuclear waste were seen as the future. Two things happened. First of all, the demand for uranium dropped after 3 Mile Island, because that was kind of one of the things. Well, 3 Mile Island ended nuclear power expansion in North America in the same way that Chernobyl ended nuclear power expansion in Europe. And so the demand for uranium dropped around the same time that we found vast reserves of uranium in several places around the world, such as Canada and Australia and Kazakhstan. So just as the demand fell off a cliff edge, the supply went up massively. And so it's just not worth it. It's just not economical to recycle the nuclear fuel in this way. For now, it's cheaper just to get rid of it. However, if we're serious about sustainability and energy security and energy abundance, these are the kind of things that we're going to have to think about. And so I would love to see a resurgence in interest in fast reactors again. And it's interesting that a lot of the small modular reactor designs that are being proposed by different companies around the world use a fast neutron spectrum. They are this type of reactor that actually burns nuclear waste. It recycles the nuclear waste into energy.
So, what do you think? I'm definitely had this as a question. What's your take on the small modular reactors? Because there seems to be a lot of hype around them, but then
there
I
is
also
a
heard
lot
some
of
very
hype.
valid arguments against them because they're not that small. So,
They're
yeah,
not.
what's your take?
Some of them are small. Some of them are like a megawatt, and they fit inside a shipping container. So they can be small, but I think the biggest danger with small. So I'll give you my biggest worry, and then my biggest reason why I'm excited about them. I think the worst thing about small modular reactors is that they might distract from the large gigawatt-sized power stations that we also need. And so I think, for example, data centers is an obvious one, hydrogen plants, really kind of energy-intensive, localized pieces of infrastructure, steel foundries, that kind of thing. Small modular reactors, great. They're almost made for those types of infrastructure. However, we still need the giant gigawatt scale power stations for the rest of the grid. Okay, and so I just worry sometimes if we all kind of get hyper focused on small modular reactors, we'll forget the bigger picture that we also need gigawatt. I'm in favor of both. The thing that I'm most excited about small modular reactors is that it's a chance for the private sector to get involved, because historically these nuclear power stations have been huge, best part of a decade to build, billions of pounds of capital needed to fund them. It's really been a game that only governments can play and nation states. Whereas the small modular reactors, they're much cheaper. A megawatt sized power station it's not that expensive. And so this is a chance for the private sector to get involved. And hopefully, with the private sector involvement, you would expect people to come up with kind of interesting, novel ways of doing things. And that will, the ratcheting effect of competition with a marketplace will hopefully make this technology even cheaper and kind of even better and quicker to deploy.
We don't have that much time left, so I wanted to bring in one variable, which is obviously the war in Iran, because we see that has a huge impact on renewables, for example, right? And appetite and energy independence that countries want, and so on. And it's almost that event that nobody expected that might change the trajectory of fossil fuels more than anything else we've seen, right? So what's been the impact on the nuclear debate?
Yeah, it's very interesting because a couple of years ago, the nuclear debate was dominated by net zero and environmental motivations. I think that has fallen fast out of favour. It's almost felt like a bucket of cold water has been thrown over everybody, and we're thinking, oh my goodness, not quite forget the environment, but it's certainly fallen way down the list of priorities, it seems, in the mainstream conversation. Energy security has become all the rage, and it's interesting that the old aphorism that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. A very similar thing happened in the early 70s with the oil embargo and the oil crisis. That's what motivated France to roll out its massive fleet of nuclear power stations. The saying at the time in 1973 was, in France, we don't have oil, but we have ideas. And their ideas was to go nuclear. And it was, in my view, the most successful and kind of grandest deployment of civil nuclear power infrastructure the world has seen. I would love it's horrible that the situation in Iran, as everyone is calling it, has happened. But, never let a crisis go to waste, as they say in politics. And wouldn't it be wonderful if this was kind of Europe's wake-up call that, actually, it's good that we're building out wind and solar. It's not going to cut it, though, in the long term. We need something else. this is our motivation to finally get our act together and relearn the art of building nuclear power stations quickly, at scale, and crucially, on budget, because we've done it before. Maybe this will be the catalyst for us to do it again. I'm slightly pessimistic. I don't think our politicians are wise enough, or what would you say? What would you say? I don't know what the word is. There's the spirit and the kind of the vitality and the boldness and the braveness to do something like what France did back in the 70s. I'm not sure our current crop of politicians have that in them, but you never know. And I guess that's what motivates me with kind of the public understanding of nuclear, and at least raising these conversations and seeding and participating in these conversations is, it's not a choice between energy security and energy affordability and the environment. We actually can do all three, but we can only do it with a massive nuclear program. And so if what's going on in Iran at the moment and the massive energy crisis that is about to hit us isn't motivation enough to sort our act out on the nuclear front, I don't know what will be. But I'd like to think I won't give up.
And you shouldn't, because I share that vision. And what I see is that it's not necessarily the politicians who are not going to do this. It's the environmentalists in our own bubble that will put a span in the works, right? And every time you talk about, this is why we're having these conversations, is because the people who are going to ask for the 700 million fish disco, they're the people who are trying to do the same thing we're trying to do, right? And similarly here, there's a huge opportunity with this oil shock of 2026, right?
There is. To your point about the environmentalists, I agree. It's disappointing. I mean, I would love the environmental movement to become champions of nuclear power. I consider myself to be an environmentalist.
Me too. This is the
large
irony,
part of the
right?
reason what motivates me. I think one of the reasons why there's such an aversion to nuclear power in the environmental movement is this appeal to nature fallacy, where there's this idea that things that are natural are good and things that are unnatural are bad. And just for some reason, sort of like in our hearts and in our chests, we feel that renewables are natural, right? Because the sun is natural.
Uranium is not, huh?
The breezes. Yeah, but somehow nuclear power stations seem very, very unnatural, when in reality, although the sun and the wind are natural, the machines that turn them into electricity are not natural. They're every bit as high-tech and futuristic as a nuclear power station. And so I think a lot of it, I don't think most of it's malice or even, it's not even stupidity or anything like that. It's just this kind of this appeal to nature fallacy that kind of misguides a lot of what the environmental movement advocate for. Organic food's another good example. It's worse for the environment because it uses so much land and the crop yields are so much lower. It's better just to intensely farm a small bit of land.
Right, now we're opening up a huge another debate, which we don't have time for. So I'll leave you with one final question.
Okay.
In Europe, aside of France, or it could even be, no, let's focus on Europe. Which country do you have the highest hopes for the next build out of nuclear?
Sweden. They're doing some amazing things in Sweden, and they seem to have some really, the kind of politicians that I was just talking about, very kind of, a lot of vitality and forward-looking. They've got that kind of institutional trust that some European countries are missing, including maybe the one that I'm broadcasting from right now. So probably Sweden or Finland as well. I mean, their nuclear program's great.
Okay, excellent. Well, Tim, thank you so much. This was
my
really,
pleasure.
Really
thank you very
great.
much. That's gone so fast. Thank you.